Well, let's start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This session is kind of atypical in this Terina conference. It's, I would say, the continuation of yesterday afternoon and this morning presentation. It's a debate on end-to-end. I will ask the panel to give their own definition or their own vision of what they understand by end-to-end. I'm the chairman of this session. My name, Jean-Paul Guigner, is down there. And we have on the panel a list of very brilliant people. I will let them introduce themselves. I'm working in the field of networking for about 30 years. Now certainly not very as competent in certain technology area as my colleagues here, more on the management side. Much involved in Renater. Renater is a French research network, and I'm also managing a technical team in the field of application for universities in France. This debate will first start by an introduction by each person of the panel, 5 minutes. You introduce yourself, you give your vision of what is end-to-end, and you mention a few issues you'd like to see raised during this debate. And I will try to give a thread, to follow a certain thread during this debate. Can you push the second slide? I mean, typical question, or if we try to classify the question, it's important to say what is not working as we would like or as it should. Why? Is it technical limitation, implementation architecture, protocol deficits, management policy? Is there a way one can contribute to improve, and who is this one? Okay. And finally, the third slide. On the third slide, I mentioned a few areas, but from what I see yesterday afternoon and from this morning speeches, I think that there are many more topics. Okay? So now I give the microphone to Brian, and you present yourself. 5 minutes, Brian.
Okay, so I'm Brian Carpenter. I'm currently working on Internet standards and technology for IBM, and before that I was at CERN running the networking group while we were not inventing TCPIP. But for a few years I was a member of the Internet Architecture Board in the IATF, and I chaired it for several years. And at one point we were wondering what topics the IAB should worry about. And a topic that came up that we then spent quite a lot of time worrying about, and I think the IAB is still worrying about, is, well, I guess the word we used at the beginning was transparency. And it turns out that when you start investigating what you mean by transparency, you very quickly hit the end-to-end argument. Now, what I want to do, since I had my shot in the other room at a general talk, is just state very narrowly what the end-to-end argument originally was, as I understand it. And this is an argument that came from what some of us call the MIT mafia. Jerry Saltz, Dave Clark, and their colleagues at MIT, quite soon after the original conception of the Internet. And the argument is that assuming that the infrastructure of the network is liable to be unreliable, maybe to be attacked, the only thing you can assume the network will do is sometimes get your packets from one end to the other. And you'll be very foolish to rely on the network for doing anything but exactly that, just sometimes getting your packets from one end to the other. So the end-to-end argument says that any function which is required to build a an application transaction, be that function reliability or security or any such thing, that function must be provided exclusively in the two end systems, and you must not make any assumptions that the network will do any of these things for you, because all it will do is perhaps deliver your packets. That is the original form of the end-to-end argument. One can discuss it at much greater length than that. And a lot of the threats I mentioned in my talk, a lot of the challenges and barriers are indeed threats and challenges and barriers to that fundamental principle. Now, it turns out, and Larry argued it yesterday, that this principle, which was put in for engineering robustness, has some unexpected side effects in the way the internet has come to be used. But that is the fundamental technical reason why we have this phrase end-to-end in our vocabulary. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Okay. My name is Dietmar Erwin. I'm from the Research Center Jülich in Germany. We are one of the largest national laboratories in Germany. I'm also the project manager for the Unicore project and for the GRIP project, which both are developing grid technology. And if you're interested, come tomorrow afternoon to the sessions. I'm seeing end-to-end from sort of the grid perspective. On one end, that's me, my laptop, my system. And on the other end, I want all the services that are available out there. Now, the challenges that I see today result from the experience in deploying grid technology to partners who are cooperating, who are collaborating there. And still there are some major difficulties that we can see. I would categorize them in two types of difficulties. One is technical challenges that have to be overcome. In the context end-to-end quality of service, that is one of the issues which is not there yet. There's a lack of standards, a lack of research so far. It's just starting to be there, and this includes the resources at the other end and also the network as a major resource. Another obstacle is lack of applications that can make use of this technology that exists. And finally, one of the technical and also policy obstacles is firewalls that are extremely important, necessary. However, they do get into the way of deployment of grid technology. Those are technical issues that will be overcome over time. I'm very confident there. But we also observe that the most difficult challenges are the non-technical challenges. The access to the resources. Some people own the resources, are responsible for the resources. So the entropia model, everything is free and you can use all the cycles. That does not work if you talk about major resources like high-performance computers, satellites, instruments where you do measurements and data archives. We have administrative autonomy over those resources. And finally, it comes all down to the question, who's paying for the service that they are getting from the grid, if we take the grid as the universal resource. This leads directly, if we settle the question of who's going to pay and what the mechanisms are there, that strong authentication is needed. You have to be sure that the person who says, I'm prepared to take up the bill, is really the person he claims to be. So strong authentication is very important. Certificates is one mechanism there. However, we notice and we know that we are not there yet. Everybody hoped that e-commerce would make this a day of life today. We're still years out from this becoming everybody's standard approach to access. And a final point there is, once you have certificates, you have to trust the authority that signed those certificates, that gave them out. And now in projects we saw that certain partners would only accept certificates issued by themselves. How does that work together with grid technology? Well, that's an interesting question. So the cross-trust of certificate authorities is one of the major challenges that cannot be easily be overcome by technical means. The technical means are there. Our software, for example, is prepared to accept any CA that the administrators are willing to accept. However, the management decision which CAs to accept is a completely different one. And with those points, I stop here and pass over the mic.
Okay, François Flückiger from CERN. You started asking what definition could we give to end-to-end. I think there are two ways of seeing end-to-end. Historically, the first time I think it was quoted, if I remember, I was just starting working. It was in the early 70s when Reed and Clark published a paper when they defined end-to-end as a new paradigm where systems communicate as with a network in between, which is as neutral as possible. The neutral should not intervene, and this is what Larry used yesterday as definition: a network which would do the minimum, such as a postal service, which just carry your parcel, but does not try to do anything else than carrying your letters or your parcels. And the other way of seeing end-to-end is, as an end user, how do we perceive the end-to-end service? Are we happy with it? Do we have frustrations? And the two do overlap, because several of the frustrations we may have are actually, as Larry mentioned yesterday, due to the fact that the network probably does more than it should do in the end-to-end initial model. So the two aspects do overlap. So on the first aspect, I should say that, I was pleased last night, John mentioned to me a new paper. I think he will show it, he will talk about it, a new manifesto from the initial inventors of this paradigm, a new manifesto which is a year ago, a year old. So when I saw that first, I said, okay, well, maybe this is a good idea, and after all, this may be what we need, despite at that time the network operators, the PTTs at that time, AT&T, our telecoms in Europe, were doing exactly the reverse, having networks which were very much intervening in your communication. You may remember that in the early 70s, we invented, and I also invented, I was one of these inventors, X25. X25 had the mechanism with, as we call it, flow control for the communications, which means that the network itself, if it felt that you were transmitting too fast, were slowing you down. So it's really intervening into your communication. It's like, think, you use a telephone network and you speak too fast for your correspondent, and he complains, and he asks the network operator, the telephone operator, to do something about it, because you speak too fast. It was as silly as that, conceptually. So at that time, it was quite a revolution to propose a system where the network should do the minimum. Okay, I think that Larry and John will carry on that. Now, on the other aspect, if I try and list my own frustration as an end user when I try and see whether I'm happy or not with the end-to-end service, I should say first that probably still my level of satisfaction is higher than my level of frustration. But nevertheless, I suffer, as all of us, of the predictability, of the lack of predictability of the quality of service. As we all know, if you want to run a video conference a given day, you will try the day before or a week before at the same time to make a test, to test whether it works over the internet. And then, whatever you do, even though you have done this test, the network is unpredictable, and the day after it may not work, just because the quality of service is not predictable. We are lacking end-to-end minimum bandwidth guarantees, even at very low level. IP telephony is not demanding at all. I mean, securing now 20 kilobits per second is nothing. But we cannot have that yet. This is a frustration. Addresses and NATs, as Brian mentioned just before this session. The 11th of September, it turned out I was in the USA, and as most people, I was stuck in my hotel for a week. And I had my laptop, I had net meeting. I tried from my room in the hotel to run net meeting with my wife in Europe and my daughter in Australia at that time. It could not work because I gave an IP number, and apparently my daughter told me, well, the IP number you gave me, I get an error message with that IP number. And as a layman person, I was told afterward, yes, because you were behind a NAT server. So I don't care about NAT. I don't want to know what NAT is. Just I could not use net meeting in a sort of emergency situation I wanted to. So these are examples of frustration. Another frustration is that I have no real confidence about the confidentiality of my mail. I know my mail is traversing a number of systems. I know no confidence in that. So these are levels of frustrations. I will stop here. I think later on, Jean-Paul will propose us topics for discussing the possible solutions or the reasons for those frustrations, and maybe I can intervene more on quality of service, which is one of the key elements of the frustrations.
Thank you. I'm Larry Lessig. I'm a professor of law at Stanford. First, let me apologize to the CERN crowd that after discussing the birth of TCPIP with Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn, and then moving on to talk about the World Wide Web, I didn't move on to talk about HTTP and HTML. So obviously CERN only gave us that killer application. Secondly, I think you'll find, if you're interested in this topic, I've put up this link to a conference we had at Stanford, The Policy Implications of End-to-End, which actually had the three end-to-end authors present, Sulzer, Clark, and Reed. And there's actually a transcript of the full-day proceedings where we brought in people from a wide range of areas, including spectrum and broadband architecture people, to discuss policy implications of end-to-end. And that brings me to my contribution to this, which is, as Brian said, I think the best way to understand this phenomenon is that technicians had a technical reason why they wanted to architect the network in a particular way. David Reed says he thought always from the beginning that there was a policy implication of this, but the real technical reason for this was to assure a certain kind of flexibility in the ability of the network to grow. But my interest in this technical architecture is the very clear set of policy implications that flow from it. And the policy implications are minimizing the opportunity for powerful actors to create choke points on the network that allow them to arrest the network and direct its evolution in one way versus another. In my view, one of the most important explanations for the growth of the original Internet is the fact that innovation was decentralized and a wide range of people could be innovators. And that was a function of this design, whether intended or not. So when there are particular issues raised about new services that the Internet must provide, for example, quality of service, in my view, the question is not so much whether we ought to provide that service or not, but how that service ought to be provided, which of a number of architectures for providing that service is most compliant with a value, such end-to-end value. And in this sense, this is actually a way of thinking that's quite familiar to constitutional law. You think of end-to-end now as a ordering value, not like an absolute condition, yes or no, but rather is this more compliant with end-to-end or less compliant with end-to-end? And you begin to pick implementations that accord with this ordering value as a way to preserve the value within the network without necessarily requiring that absolutely every single thing be perfectly end-to-end compliant. In the same way that all free countries have a principle of freedom of speech, that doesn't mean there's no regulation of speech. It just means that every single regulation that affects speech is constantly tested according to this particular value. And that's the place, I think, that end-to-end, the role that end-to-end can play in this debate.
Okay, so my name is... that's working. My name's John Crowcroft, and I don't know how to work a laptop. Here we go. I used to be at University College London for the last 20 years. I guess we were one of the 3 nodes on the SatNet, which was the second network in the internet. The upper net wasn't the internet. In 81, I was responsible for running the first IP router in the UK, which was quite fun. Now I moved to Cambridge University, where I used to be a physicist a long time ago, like lots of people in computing and networking. I'm quite interested in aggressively pushing the end-to-end model. Let me give three points I want to make. The first is sort of responding to Larry's talk and a couple of points here. One way to look at end-to-end is it's kind of should be a right, but then it means you have to take responsibility. Everyone has to take responsibility. People that introduce boxes that mess with end-to-end should be sued. Usually these boxes reduce the services you can get. If you can't get a net meeting and you had an IP address and it should work to get you global connectivity, somebody's not offering you an internet service. If they claim they are, then that's covered by the Trade Subscriptions Act in many countries, which means that they are in breach of a law. And there are many ways you can use this. One problem, of course, is you're an individual up against an organization, so we should just get together. There's an interesting problem. Standards, don't you love them? Okay, so the bottom line here is we should balance the legal incentives properly, and we should bring large class actions against people who are incompetent. Second point, it doesn't really matter in the end, because end-to-end will win, because basically the internet has introduced this concept to people, and it will root around damage. This is a very famous quote. I can't remember who said it first. Gilmore, okay, right. So the point about routing around damage is we don't have to use IP to route around damage. We can use anything. Most of the papers submitted to the major conferences in the last 2 years, which I'm on the program committee for, which is most of the major networking conferences such as ACM, SIGCOM, or IEEE Infocom, or a bunch of others, most of the interesting researchers at MIT, Berkeley, Cambridge, name a few places, there's some other good places, are working on peer-to-peer and overlay systems. What do? They route around damage. They don't do it using IP. You can get QoS with an overlay network. I will turn my phone off. You can get QoS with an overlay network. In fact, the grid people are building grid-based overlay networks just to do this because nobody else will give it to them. Really interesting area, though, to attack end-to-end going the opposite way. Is when people mess with end-to-end in the middle, remove them. That's another way of doing things. You can route around them, or you can remove them. So one of the things I'm working on is a project with David Reed and Dave Clark at MIT, Cambridge, the original Cambridge and Cambridge, Massachusetts, are working on a project to basically look at how you would do a completely decentralized spectrum allocation with no regulator, no spectrum owner. The reason for doing this is we remove ISPs from the equation. ISPs are becoming the new telcos. They won't deploy stuff because their business planning timescales are too short and their imagination is too small. They're very competent technically. You talk to operation staff, sysadmin and ISPs, they're really cool people. They're people like us. However, they're controlled. Their resources are managed very tightly. So we need to work around them. The interesting thing about wireless is we have 2 approaches. I have examples here in my hand. Here is a nice Ericsson phone which has Bluetooth and GPRS and is centrally controlled and centrally managed, and the spectrum is centrally allocated. And here is an 802.11 card which I can get at the net here. I can walk around Cambridge, Massachusetts getting free 11 megabit access to the internet. Leased addresses wherever I walk down half a dozen streets there. Which is better? I could start paying for this. I would happily pay for this if somebody figures out how to do that. That's what we're working on. If you then get rid of the base station, you have a significantly dense number of people. Dispersive path routing, multipath routing means that bandwidth goes up with the number of users. This actually gives a very, very big exponential win-win equation for a real end-to-end and no middle. Nobody can mess with that. So that's an interesting space to go. Lastly, I guess there's just looking at the content level rather than networking, most of the end-to-end argument is technically argued around what IP does and where IP might go when you add gizmos and gadgets and what have you, and what TCP has to do. When you look at the content level, everyone messes with content routing and modifications, and I would just refer people to Sally Floyd's draft. I don't know where that's gone now, but basically, I don't mind people messing with content. Hey, I watch TV and get advertisements, and I get different versions of movies and so on. I just want to know. Okay, so that's a very simple, informed consent is sort of part of the equation.
When we started this talk, I thought I didn't have slides. Might turn out I still don't. Okay, we can talk about technology for a change. We've talked most about policy. Quality of service means that you're throwing away packets. The problem with deploying quality of service is that the cost is happening in the middle of the network, and the cost is there all the time. While the effect is totally invisible when the system is working perfectly. It's when it's going into crisis that you actually see the difference between quality of service and non-quality of service. That I should say quality of service guarantees. Customers are rational, most of them. If they don't see an effect 99% of the time, they won't pay for it. Now, governments can be an exception to that. That's because they don't have the option of going home when the network breaks down. The easy part of quality of service involves congestion at endpoint. To put it this way, end-to-end consists of 5 parties, not 2. You have one user, the end. You have his immediate environment, let's call it the edge. You have the core, which we think of as the core of the internet. I mean, the internet has no core. That's one of its strengths. And that's one reason why it's so hard to put equipment there. And it's the other edge and the end user. In the case of a customer talking to an ISP, it's pretty easy to get quality of service on that particular link. It's even really simple to put quality of service when you got someone else connected to the same ISP. That's why provider-based VPNs are popular, at least with a provider. The hard thing comes when you have someone out there. The reason being that to the people who operate pieces of the core, this picture is a lot more true. There are unpredictable patterns of connections, and 99% of the people who want to make demands of you are people you don't have a business relationship with. Who's the customer? Another thing that influences, where policy or law influences technology, is that anyone who offers service and can get away with not promising anything is very happy, because when he hasn't promised anything, it's impossible to sue him for damages. So law influences technology just as the other way around. So as long as we stay along the edges of the internet, quality of service is easy, also in the end-to-end model. Because you just go from end to edge and back out to end. Both ends have a relationship with the edge that is having to do the work. It's a reasonably small amount of work. The hard problem is when we reach across the internet, where you are using networks where you have no direct business relationship with them. And remember, if we could engineer the network so that throwing away packets was a reasonably rare occurrence, we wouldn't need quality of service. But it's hard to do that. So, quality of service is a pain. The rest of end-to-end, apart from security, seems preaching the gospel to me. I got nothing more to say about it.
Okay. This is going to be fun, because I'm going to contradict Harald. But on the short term only. I mean, I agree with you on the principle, but I was going to say I'm taking sort of the second tack that François took and look at it as a customer. Basically saying, you know, end-to-end to me is sort of the service that I get. And if I look at it like it's now, actually the problem is at the edges. Because at least the ISPs I'm using are sufficiently over-provisioned so that all the stuff I want to do, and this is not sort of, you know, gigabit stuff, it's just, you know, the proverbial voice over IP, downloading a few web pages, transferring a couple of files, playing multi-user games and things like that. Where I see that I have the problem really on the last mile on the local loop, because I just moved from a major metropolitan area to a rather less populated area. But even in the major metropolitan areas, the local loop is actually for most of those things I'm doing, at least my today's experience, the choke point is the limited bandwidth there. So in the short term, actually, that's something that needs attention, and to us basically go on and who can do something about that. Well, that's mainly the telcos, and for I think economic reasons, many of them don't have an interest to do that. What I really would like to see is that this local loop, last mile thing becomes a utility just like electricity and water and what have you. And I'm not saying the whole internet, I'm just saying this local part. And then I go with you. See, I'm quite happy to see what John just said. I mean, just do this on the air, cut out the middleman and be done. And if this can be done, that would be really nice. I'm not so sure whether the economic models would work. But okay. But that's the way I would like to see it. In many countries now, in Europe here, you can buy electricity from multiple companies. But it doesn't mean that they all have to put a cable into your house. That's done sort of basically in the books. And you can do something like that with packets as well. If you have a local infrastructure that carries the traffic from your house to points of presence of the wide area carriers, let's call them. I'd like to see that. And I think there might be a role for public policy to actually push that along a bit if it can be done. The other is the quality of service. I think actually what in my daily experience is that the quality of service at the end is what matters. Because what happens, I mean, I'm going to get technical now. What happens to me is like I'm at the end of a very low bandwidth local loop. And my only quality of service problem is with voice over IP. I use that daily. The private exchange at my house is connected to some other things via voice over IP. And since my bandwidth is very low, what happens is when I have a telephone call, I have to tell everybody in the house not to download large web pages because it will not work anymore. The only thing that's needed to fix this is diff-serve on the last hop. So I have to convince my ISP that I can tell it somehow that your packets colored like this should have precedence, queuing precedence, just on that last router. And the standards are there, the products are there, but it's not deployed. And I know for this particular ISP, I'm not the only one who's asking for this, but for them to provision it and to get it deployed is actually the problem. But when I tell everybody in the house not to do anything, so that demands large bandwidth, my voice over IP quality to the rest of the world is perfect. I can make telephone calls. It's just this last piece. So it's exactly, my experience today is exactly the opposite of what you said. It's an easy problem. Yeah. In terms of architecture, in terms of protocols and whatever, but it's not deployed. So who can do something about that? Well, those ISPs. And so this was, but again, the last thing I want to say is we have to put all this stuff into perspective. I think the internet still works around lossage, and we're doing the best end-to-end job that's ever been done, even better, I think, than the telephone network, because we can run more applications there. And even for people behind nets, the end-to-end quality is much better than any other infrastructure that is there or was there.
Thank you very much. Well, François said that his satisfaction was greater than his frustration. Daniel ended by saying that protocol is there, standards are there, but just if you want to be satisfied, you have to act on someone, on somebody, and mainly certainly the ISP who, are the one who blocked the system in the local loop. I didn't put on the list of topics we were to tackle today the local bandwidth local loop. Perhaps it's interesting to have some questions from the floor to have an idea of what are the situation in different countries. For instance, in France, we have for our research community, we have a model based on a national backbone, and then we have regional networks. National backbone itself is going to be Renater 3 and Lambda, so optical fiber to the main gigs. Then we have regional networks which are funded by regional governments and users. But these regional networks, in terms of bandwidth, are less performant. And they do not connect every site. Some sites have to themselves connect directly by, I would say, the available, of course, local loop. This is the situation in France. I'm not talking about the end users and individuals at home who can have only telephone access or ADSL for some, but ADSL is not very much deployed. Any question, any comment on that in countries? Otherwise, I think that the first topic I'd like to be mentioned is security. We have talked a lot about security, about middle boxes who are in the way of users, and people who someone told that people were not competent to manage middle boxes and should be sued. But there is a problem to sue these people, I think, Larry can say. Suppose these middle boxes are put in place in accordance with the university policy. Who can sue these people? It's a question.
That's not a public service provider.
Okay, it's not a public.
That's part of your job description. So that's different.
That's different. But anyway, for people around the table, for some who wants to put in place grid computing, this is still a nightmare to have this in the middle.
What we see is those early adopters of firewall technology had one thing in mind, namely security of their environment, protect everything against attacks from the outside and sometimes also from getting malicious users from the inside out to the world. So they have put up policies which are simply not working in the context of access. So if you have to negotiate a port or a service to go through a firewall with the with the security officer, that can be extremely painful. So what we are seeing here, that the technology is there, however, deploying it is becoming extremely difficult.
This is actually a very good example of responsibility. When we've been putting up the UK grid, and we have a large £130 million program with 3 years, and firewalls are running at under 100 megabits a second. We have a 10 gig network, and they're a pain in the neck. The claim by local administrators is they're saving users from themselves. They put up firewalls because there are insecure systems within their site, and the firewall will stop outsiders hacking. 98% of hacks come from inside, so the firewall does no good whatsoever. All the statistics are extremely well published. Most of the hacks that come from outside happen at the application level, which the firewall can do nothing about. They're viruses on Microsoft email. So these guys do nothing except get in the way. They are wasting our money, and they are removing services from us, and it's you can show it by the evidence, and it's quite incredible that they get away with these excuses. And that's what I mean by taking responsibility. They should take responsibility. They should look at what they're spending and why they're spending it, and what service do they provide. The correct service is to use products that Microsoft, for example, have, like personal firewalls, and install them on every end system available, run decent virus checkers on every end system available. People that don't accept that that service have to take responsibility for their end system. For example, most of our users can go and get trained in how to set up a Linux or a BSD or a Mac OS system to be secure. Or they can get, the university will underwrite the costs of putting a decent firewall on their system. It has to be an end system firewall. And then it's not in the middle of the network. So the facts fly in the face of this. And it's amazing that these people get away with this firewall security argument within the middle of the network. It simply doesn't help as well as hindering. It doesn't fix the problem as well as causing other problems, which is quite extraordinary. Once upon a time, the Milnet had a bunch of bridges around it. This was the earliest example. I don't know if anyone can remember the Milnet. There was the ARPANET, the Milnet, and the SATNet were the first three networks connected in the internet. The Milnet had this because they had a bunch of software for which they didn't have the source, so they could not add security to their systems. We're not in that situation anymore. Okay, so there is a cost to putting in false security, which is it reduces performance and so on, but there's another cost, which is it makes people not bother with end system security, and the end systems are still vulnerable to most of the attacks, which are internal, and the application level attacks, which are external. So site security managers need to be sued if they don't do their job correctly, and I would say most of them that put in firewalls do not do their job properly.
So being taunted now twice about who should be sued, I have to step in, and I want to put this in a little bit of suing context. This is one of the real problems to the decision initially with TCPIP originators and then the originators at CERN of HTTP and HTML to put these protocols in the public domain. Because the consequence of putting them in the public domain is that there's no possibility of asserting that somebody is, quote, violating the IP protocol in a legal sense. Now, there was another option, right? You could have created something called the Internet. That would have been a trademark. And then if somebody offers something that they call the Internet that doesn't comply with the rules of the trademark, then you could have sued them. So this would have been a nice legal technique to say, we are putting firewalls in the middle of the Internet, and that's completely screwing up our performance, not doing any good. And read the Salzer, Clark, and Reed article because it applies directly for the reasons you're talking about. Both of them sort of offer these reasons to show why you should be doing the security at the end, and you're violating our trademark now. That's actually what Sun's strategy with respect to Java really is about. It's so that they can say everything's going to be compliant with Java, and if you use the word Java and it's not compliant, you violated our trademark. But we have no such option in the context of the Internet right now. And so all that we can do in the context of the Internet is the other part of what you were saying, which I completely agree with, which is to fight stupid implementations. But that's just fighting stupidity. It's not invoking legal stupidity to fight stupidity. It's just saying this is a stupid implementation. And here too, I think from my perspective, I think we got to distinguish between evil stupidity and just stupid stupidity, right? Evil stupidity is the kind of stupidity which is being deployed for the purpose of leveraging monopoly power in a particular way, right? And that's the kind of stupidity I think governments really ought to be worried about. And we ought to talk about ways to implement regulatory regimes to assure that kind of leveraging of monopoly stupidity doesn't occur. But stupid stupidity is just, competitors who are being stupid. And I don't really know that governments need to do anything about that because the competitive system typically can help us deal with that on its own. It's only the monopoly evil stupidity that really I think is threatening the underlying values of the end-to-end model. I have to interject, which is do a dangerous thing, which is to correct a lawyer on a legal matter. The Internet protocols are not in the public domain. They are freely reproducible. There's a slight difference, which has to do with saying that if you misrepresent what you have as being TCPIP while not being TCPIP, you can get yourself into trouble. I was slapped with this difference some time ago, and my head is still spinning from it. Yeah, there's actually this distinction that you're talking about. If I say this is TCPIP and it's not TCPIP, I have misrepresented, and there's a Tor in certain commercial context, there's a cause of action for misrepresenting something. But that's not because TCPIP is protected by intellectual property laws. It's not. It is technically in the public domain. So in the public domain in the sense that they just gave it to the public domain, for very important, and you can talk, Cerf and Khan both have these discussions about why they did it, and you can understand why in the context of the military they wanted to do it. But it is in the public domain, and that means that there's nobody who can say this is, we're going to modify TCPIP in this way, and if you're going to continue to use it or deploy it, you would violate our trademark if you did it differently. So trademark is a private intellectual property cause of action. The misrepresentation one is just a general misrepresentation point.
Incidentally, the word internet has been specifically declared non-trademarkable because the Internet Society went to some lengths in dealing with a company which claimed to have a trademark on the word internet, and it took about 10 years to resolve this issue, till the company that had claimed that trademark actually folded and gave up. I think they changed their name. But what I really wanted to say is something a little bit along a different track. Let's assume that you're right and there is no very obvious mechanism for suing people because they claim to be providing TCP/IP and they're not. In the telephone world, there are, at least in some countries, universal service obligations. Right? And I really, really hate to say this, but there is one conceivable model which is to design a universal service obligation for anyone who claims to be an internet service provider. And clearly, in this context, part of the universal service requirement would be transmitting IP packets from end to end. And, I don't know if that's something that is... It's a dangerous thing to say because, as I said this morning, regulators are very tempted to regulate because that's all they know how to do. But I do wonder if we shouldn't think about it.
Well, okay. Last intervention.
Yeah, going back to the security aspect, the security aspect is not something that is an internet service provided thing when it's in the middle of the network. It's something that's been added as a wart, at the end. And there is an end-to-end security model. Many of us may be using privacy-enhanced mail of some description, maybe pretty good privacy or what have you, and as IPsec. So there are sort of standards for this, but most of the security glitches that break the end-to-end model are not security. And that was the point I was trying to make. So, and they're not really to do with this legal framework about what IP is and what service an ISP might or might not provide. They're a thing that has sort of emerged due to legislation often. For example, when you're trying to do experiments measuring the net, nowadays you probe a number of sites and suddenly you find the vice chancellor of your university phoning up your system administrator who comes around with a lawyer's letter saying, why are you attacking our site? And you say, but I'm pinging it. I see. That's because intrusion detection system, fire warning, and so on. And that's because their site has an incompetent security manager, not because your vice chancellor is an idiot, because their site is stupid. And their site security manager is stupid because they triggered events in their intrusion detection system which were inappropriately triggered. And in fact, that wasn't a security attack. It wasn't profiled as one of the 17 well-known Christmas tree TCP attacks or what have you. But these are not to do with the standard IP model. They're to do with stuff people have glommed on more recently, and I think are very unfortunate. So just to the topic of security, I think while we do have good and true and proper end-to-end security systems, most of the things we're seeing that attack the end-to-end model are in fact they're probably stupidity. But in some cases, they're evil stupidity and should certainly be, should see the light of day in some court somewhere, I think.
I think it's time to give the microphone to the floor. Please, you can take this. On the two first topics, security and legal issue, try to to stick to this. When you obviously, please give your name and affiliation.
I would like to comment on the end system security. In my opinion, it's not only a matter of competence of the users, it's also the matter of the quality of the software and the actually properties of the software that the users are using. So there are two problems. One is that most users still use software that's not subject to any kind of review and everything, and suffers from code bloat and everything. And second, perhaps more important problem is that all software, be it commercial or free, comes explicitly without any warranty of any kind. So it's difficult to make users liable for the problems of the software that they are not causing, actually. That's
yeah, but no, it's not an answer to that one. Okay, you can still make the users liable, not the producers of the software. And I think you could even conceivably get software with a warranty if you were willing to pay for it. The point here, the point with security that I think most often gets disregarded is that security is not an absolute thing. It's a gradation. You can be sort of totally insecure. You can be totally secure. Whether once you're totally secure you can do anything useful is a different question. And it's in the end-to-end model. It's the end systems that communicate that have to decide which level of security they want and the price they want to pay for it. And as is a fact of life, that you don't lock your doors usually until you or somebody in the neighborhood has been burglared. And you don't put a bigger lock on the door until somebody has been broken into. I mean, not just somebody walked in. And you don't put guards around your house until, and that's the thing. It's not the quality of the software. It's just not the perceived need. You get away with not doing it. And the usual argument you have with users is if you try to convince people to deploy security, is like, what is it going to cost me, and what is it, and how is it going to hamper me in the things I want to do? And that's the fundamental problem, not the technology, not anything else.
I perfectly agree. I mean, if we are not ready to pay for what we want, I mean, we'll have middle boxes for years and years. There, please. Where is the big microphone?
Okay, I'd like to aggressively agree with John Crowcroft, but from perhaps a rather aggressive perspective. Had he gone to that ancient university more than 3 years ago, he would probably be, and followed the line he was talking, he'd be suing me, because I was responsible for the central computing service. I know what it's like to be responsible for that, and we do stupid things because we don't know better, but also because we have a perspective of having to serve the complete community. And we say we mustn't do anything unless we can do it for everybody, which is not true, it's not required. So lots of problems in this. And I agree the firewalls get in the way. I've just been trying to send some mail back home, and I can't because I didn't know the address of an SMTP server that would accept me. I have now, I've had to ask. But that's crazy, this non-relaying of mail. So I entirely agree with you. But my point back to you is, then why aren't you suing my successor in Cambridge? Why aren't you working on him and educating him in what to do? Because if you don't, he won't know.
Brian.
Yeah, I think John wants to. I think John wants to consult his lawyer before answering your question. Actually, I wanted to comment that this isn't only universities that have this problem; corporations have this problem as well. And if you talk to the people responsible for security, in a large corporation which has real secrets to protect, they are just very, very scared and very, very cautious, and they will always err on the side of caution. And the perception in the operational security community, I don't mean the academic security community, but the operational security community, is that there is a best current practice, and the best current practice is a firewall with all the ports closed down, except a few that you've decided to allow. Now, this can have some quite amusing side effects, by the way. I can give you one amusing side effect, which is if you're running a massive web server that is configured to scale up to dealing with thousands and thousands of simultaneous requests, and there are such boxes, and I can introduce you to a salesman if you want one. These things have to open lots and lots and lots and lots of tiny TCPs, especially if they're still getting HTTP 1.0 clients coming in. And it turns out that they start at port number 2 to the 32nd minus 1, or whatever it is, 2 to the 16th minus 1, and work backwards, because that's how you use the dynamically allocated port numbers. And they get down, if there are enough transactions going, into the registered port numbers. And look, quite a lot of the registered port numbers are blocked in firewalls because they've been used by Napster or Nutella or something in the past. So you get completely incomprehensible failures because some poor customer is trying to load a web page, runs multiple tiny TCPs because of the Netscape hack, and one or two of these tiny TCPs happen to hit a port number which is blocked in the firewall. It's just an example of what can happen because of the current extreme conservatism of corporate security people. But they're only doing their jobs, so we have to tell them how to do it better.
I have to agree with John here. It's not conservatism, it's laziness. It's just because it's easier to deploy the central solution and claim you have solved the problem than to deploy the distributed solution and educate the users. And see, if I was, I've been there in this gentleman's chair at some point, and I would do exactly the same thing because, it doesn't mean I have to work all night and hire people to educate users and to make sure they deploy all this stuff. But it's just a non-solution. I agree totally with both John and well, I don't know whether Brian agrees with that, but it's basically laziness, and it's not conservatism. That's at least my point of view. Okay.
There's a question.
Well, my name is Gail Hoffman from the German Weather Service, running a reasonably large organization with a couple of thousand users and supercomputers and everything. I think the problem you may not see fully is that most of these users use the internet only rarely, and they use the internal network most of the time. And to make their life more difficult by using the internal network, by forcing them to use the security issues, which they usually are not used anyway to cope with, I think you make their life a misery. And I think the users actually demand that they're not being forced to have end security on their own client, because they use their client for all sorts of things, not only to use the internet. But they do use the internet as well. And at some stage, therefore, you come to the conclusion you have to have a centralized system which makes their life easier, where you have a firewall. So that internally, they trust each other, they work together, and I know that 98% of all the hacks come from inside, never mind, we can live with that. But we cannot live with the 2% which come from the outside. So what do we do? Thank you.
There's a term in the security which was made very popular by Jeff Schiller of the security area of the ITF. When someone comes along and says, I want something, I have my way of doing things and I want something that fixes the security problems. He calls it pixie dust. It's I'm sorry, it's impossible to get the internet and get the benefits that come from using the internet and not have end system security. The end system security might be able to be weaker because of the presence of firewalls. For instance, I don't have to install filters on each of my individual PCs at home because I block the file sharing ports at the border router. But at some level, we have to do end system security, and we have to make it easy to use. That's the vendor's problem, and trustworthy, which is a hell of a problem. But sooner or later, we have to switch to a model of end system security. Just think about how many of your researchers are carrying these things around to conferences and plugging it to the network. Guess who's guarding them?
I think just to respond to, I think, the gentleman back here as well as that point, a firewall is not binary. You can have an evolutionary approach to this. So, for example, in the computer lab in University of Cambridge, we have 3 supported security levels. One is you go and get trained and you know how to run security on your end system. And in some cases that may involve spending money because the default end system is insecure, so you need to buy a personal firewall, for example. Or you need to know how to install Red Hat so it doesn't default to leaving a bunch of things on, which is stupid. So you learn that. The second level is that you run a service managed system which has all that done for you and it's secure. And the third level is you run any old system you like and you are completely blocked from internet access and you have to go to another computer and access the internet. And that seems to be reasonably acceptable. That was actually the model we were evolving to in my previous university. It seemed like a rather nice model. And it's evolutionary. As systems get better, they're audited, we're assured about them, we say, they move into, they're either centrally managed or you get trained how to manage them and they're okay. And then eventually all these systems are okay. And that creates an environment where everything tends to need good end-to-end access. And this middle box firewall, NAT, etc. fades away, evaporates. So yeah, I mean that's why I was taking an extreme position. I do understand why you have to say people. That was going back to the Milnet. That was why the Milnet bridges were developed originally. Exactly the same reason that they had no audit, they had no way of fixing the internal systems, and they had complete idiots running them. So.
Thank you for this perhaps conclusion on security. Each time we talk about security, we can spend hours. I know that because I'm involved in security too. One point has not been mentioned. Sorry, spamming. Spamming is not end-to-end, but no. It was a question. It was a question to Larry. Spamming today is a pain in the neck for I think everybody here. About 80% of the mail I received. 80, 90 for you perhaps. What to do? I mean, on the technical ground, who has a solution? If someone has a solution, please raise your hand. On the legal plan, how are things evolving? If you can give us some hints.
So, for many years there was the view in the United States that there should be no legal solution because the internet shouldn't be regulated. And then people noticed that the internet was being regulated in all sorts of other ways to benefit copyright holders, for example. And then they said, well, why not some for ourselves too? So now there's a big debate about how to regulate to deal with spam. And so far the regulations have, in my view, been not evil stupid, but just stupid. They don't... I think there's a relatively simple solution to this, which is a mix between technology and legal regulation. The relatively simple solution is the legal regulation has 2 parts. Part 1 says there's a standard tag that goes on unsolicited commercial email, whether it's the ADV tag or whatever in a subject line. And Part 2 says if you send spam that doesn't have that tag, then any bounty hunter who hunts you down and finds you gets $5,000 of your assets. Right? Now, the reason why this, I think, is a solution is, first of all, if spam had a simple tag, there's a simple way for people who don't want to receive it to block it out, and of course 90% of us would block it out, and that would end the market for spam right there. The advantage of the second part is most of the legal solutions right now imagine the Attorney General bringing a lawsuit, or imagine Stanford University bringing a lawsuit, and Attorney General and Stanford University have better things to do, right? But if you take all the underutilized coders out there who could hack around and find this spammer in 10 minutes and get a $5,000 payment for doing it, this solution would this bounty solution would actually create a huge enforcement mechanism out there, which would be everybody who's got a couple hours left in their day, and then very quickly I think you would track down the people who don't comply with a very simple requirement, which is labeling. And that, I think, would actually have a pretty significant effect with relatively minimal legal intervention.
I think you're misrepresenting where you're from. You're not from the East. Much
There's a slight problem. Do you want to give me your $5,000 now or after I have fake spam in your name?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you've got to demonstrate that it's actually that person, right? So that person's going to have to succeed in proving that it was that person who sent the spam.
Succeed in making it probable and in front of what audience, and what's the expense of that?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Well, and the expenses of my burden because you faked spam from me, you're going to have to pay for it. When one of the 10,000 people are going to try to track you down. But that's a problem that exists right now anyway, right?
And what if that person happens to be in China?
Yeah. Okay. So, but here's a very big difference between the culture of technologists and the culture of lawyers, right? So the technologist says, this is a solution that only does 95% of the problem solved, or even 80% of the problem solved, and therefore it's not a solution, right? The lawyer's response is, this is a solution that does 80% of the problem solved. Wow, that's an amazing solution for the law, right?
Yeah, but 90% of the spam comes from Korea.
No, the real problem is really in another dimension, which is, I think an 80% solution would be glorious, but you would probably get rid of 80% of burglaries by handing out free handguns to everyone. Do you create a more dangerous problem?
Well, I understand the problem with the handguns, but what's the more dangerous problem here? All you're doing is requiring people to put 3 characters in the front of a subject line.
No, the problem is that the easy settlement mechanism is creating a tool for extortion, just like the UDRP is being uniform. The resolution policy for domain name conflict is being used to extort money in various interesting ways.
Yeah, so UDRP is, and I agree, that's a very big problem.
Well, by the way, I think the UDRP is far superior to the previous policy for settlements. It definitely settled 95% of the problem, but there are some pains in the 5%.
Right. So UDRP might be a little bit far afield from the end-to-end discussion, but let's get to a little bit less far afield, the spam part of it. UDRP does create the problem of extortion, I agree. But in this story I'm telling, basically this bounty hunter comes to an agency, like for example the FCC, and says this is the person, and then the FCC's got to decide whether they actually enforce the judgment against that person. I agree there's a potential for some extortion problems, but there's potential for extortion in all sorts of other contexts too. Faking email, asserting all sorts of things that I didn't assert could be a way of extorting things out of me. So there's an extortion problem, but the question is whether the risk of the extortion problem is so much greater than the potential for shutting down most businesses that are going to make any money from playing the spam game.
Sorry to have raised this topic. Going a little bit further, but in relation with security, PKA, I was very naive. I thought at one time that PKA was going to solve many problems and perhaps to provide end-to-end solution, global end-to-end solutions, security solutions associated with directory services. I'd like to have your feeling on that and why, for some people, PKI will never exist as one PKI will never exist, so we will end up with a bunch of certification authority and problem of course, in the trust path.
Why this is? Sorry, did you ask why this is like that? No. Yeah, Fred asserted, and it will never exist. I was fairly pessimistic as well. I'm not sure it's very easy to articulate the answer, and if Fred's in the room, he can maybe help us. But I believe the notion of one PKI, a real global PKI, quite apart from the scaling problem with the world population, 12 billion or whatever it's going to be, it becomes a public good, right? At that point, it becomes something which only exists. It doesn't exist for the benefit of individual companies. It exists for the benefit of the economy as a whole and the population as a whole. And those are difficult things to construct. And I'm sure Larry can be much more eloquent than I can about why they're difficult to construct. Why are there multiple credit card companies? We only really need one when you think about it. Because if there was only one credit card company, it would have to end up as a government-regulated monopoly. Otherwise, there will be all kinds of abuses. And I think the PKI story is actually quite like that. There is no commercial incentive to provide a universal PKI unless there is some monopoly profit in it, and that's not what we want to get.
Well, I think I do agree with what Brian said, but maybe I have a simpler explanation. I think that it may not fly as a single overlay infrastructure because it's not mandatory. If we look at the middleware infrastructure that exists today, there is only one which has been set up globally and which does everything because it's mandatory. This is the DNS. All the others are failed. If you look at, we have no global, unique overlay network of web caches. We have no global, single overlay network of multicast replicators. Because there are additional functionalities that are not mandatory. So I'm quite pessimistic. My belief is that none of those overlay networks will establish themselves as a single middleware because none of them will be mandatory.
And even taking the fact that we will not have one single PKI worldwide, the point is, or the observation that I would like to share with you, and I would like to ask the audience what your situation is. How many people are using certificates actually to sign their email? So everybody's complaining my email is insecure. However, you have the technology available that you could actually do the authentication and you could do the encryption, but nobody's doing it.
Pretty good is good enough.
Or that. I get only one email from one person assigned with PGP. I get no email from anybody in the security community and all those organizations dealing with security which are signed. I get sometimes complaints when I send signed email because it messes up their browser.
I didn't raise my hand, but we are using it in between our security correspondent in universities. I'm trying to.
One more answer. I mean, sort of going from left to right. I'm more in François' line. I think the underlying reason that there will be not one global PKI is that there's not one global operator or set of operators that we trust. And it models trust, doesn't it? So, and it's just unrealistic to assume that we will ever have everybody trusting one organization or set of organizations. And the only reason we have it for the DNS is that it's beneficial to have a single namespace.
But that's not at all incompatible with what I said.
No. I'm just saying
because the only model that works is effectively a public monopoly.
I'm not at issue. I'm just saying It's just more fundamental than that. There's no economic incentive.
Okay, I'm Thomas Scheffler from T-Systems Germany. I just wanted to add to this discussion. I mean, everybody seems to agree that PKI will be something which would be very valuable to have, and again, everybody agrees that it's not something we are going to have in the foreseeable future. So I think this is somehow contradictory, and we should do something about this. And I think what hinders the whole debate is that we put too much into this, or we put too much expectations into this trust debate. So is this really the case that if I get a certificate issued by an authority which I trust, that I automatically then trust the other person or trust the other partner? I think trust needs to be established between the partners and not being a transitive way of distributing trust along a trust chain and distributing this along some certificate chains. So I think what needs to be done is to find a minimal set of functionalities that your PKI should support, and I think the only thing which is sensible is to authenticate somebody who is presenting the certificate, and everything else should be left to the partners to agree upon. And I think in this sense we would be able to create a similar global PKI by just handing this function to something like a global organization like the UN, or I mean, it could be done in Europe so that the European Commission or something is doing something like this. But it's not. Well, it's just my opinion that we should do something about this and simplify the debate and not try to do it all, but start simply.
We actually did that. Dig out the original RFC 1400 something documents for privacy enhanced mail, PAM. At one point we had a single point of authority in the internet called the Internet Policy Certification Authority, IPSRA. Only problem was nobody trusted it. I actually managed to have an UNIT project have its policies signed by this certificate authority, and and have it issue a certificate to me, so that you could actually verify from this so-called internet trusted route down to me. It didn't help any. Nobody else was listening. I think personally that anytime we try to create one of anything, we are either very lucky or we have a big mess. With the internet, we're very lucky. With the DNS, we were very lucky and had a mess. It's now called ICANN. With the PKI, we just had a mess. So I believe that there's a certain value in the trend we're seeing now, where we deploy multiple PKIs for multiple purposes, and actually are getting used to navigating in a web of trust built on multiple PKIs, instead of assuming that there will be a simple path from whatever you want proven to the root of the universe. So perhaps we should think less about building the single PKI than about technology for weaving PKIs together. In some ways, the web of trust in PGP is a PKI. It's just an oddly shaped one.
An interesting place to look at the notion of trust is England. We have a almost God-given right to multiple identities. We have no identity cards. I can have multiple identities. My children have 3 identities. They actually have 2 nationalities as well. In that situation, it illustrates that you establish trust in a context. Each trust is in a given context, so for creditworthiness and so on. There's a very nice paper by Ross Anderson. I was putting up a webpage earlier about his book, and it's in that book as well, about security engineering, about what happens if you try and have a single source of authority and trust, for example, with ID cards, and then you revoke them. You could have your credit card revoked because you're out of credit and actually be a volunteer fire person not able to rescue somebody and they die because your credit card was taken away and it was your only card. And you could not get into your house because your credit card has been revoked because it's all one revocation mechanism. Now, obviously, there are technical solutions to that, but one of the nice social things about having multiple identities in the UK is that it's up to you how you partition those things. It's not up to some other authority, so you get multiple solutions. And I think that's inherent. Having multiple trust chains and not single hierarchies is absolutely essential. PKI's got that unfortunate P in it, and PGP's got the sort of pretty good unfortunate bit in it. What we need is the sort of trustworthiness of a set of systems that are good, and scaling properties of a large-scale system that deals with lots and lots of trust relationships and efficient issuing of certificates and revocation, but with some kind of scoping that individuals control somehow. And that's quite a subtle business. I have no idea how to get there, but I think until we figured that out, then everyone's going to muddle along in the way we are. That I do have signed sealed emails sometimes, and I do send it sometimes, but only occasionally, because it's a bit messy and it involves setting up all kinds of things. So, so I think there's somewhere in the middle, but it's not in the middle of a spectrum. It's actually a far more complicated and subtle task that captures some very subtle social situations. Imagine revoking trust for all of China every 10 years as it becomes and then loses its most favored trading nation status. But this is the kind of scaling problem you have to deal with, right? And that's just that's a silly example, perhaps not silly.
Well, one other thing is not to go, if it's PKIs, not to fall into the trap of saying that actually the web of trust or the lack of a single one is a major barrier to deployment. I think another big barrier to deployment, again, is the cost. Because it requires training, procedures, and applications that actually do this easily. And I think that's at least as big a barrier as the lack of infrastructure.
Thank you. It's my responsibility to let you go to lunch not too late. So I think that I wrote down 6 topics. We have tackled only 3 of them. We have to stop here. What we can perhaps get as a conclusion is that we are responsible. Remember, I said, what is not working, why it is not working, what can be the work we can do, how can we react, and who are the one. I mean, we are all responsible, in fact, for putting end-to-end security to work. Perhaps I'm naive, perhaps to have some PKA, even if it costs to work. And, of course, IPv6. I mean, IPv6 is supposed to bring us a marvelous world. It's not yet, like PKI, it's not yet here. But it will be for, I think, another debate. Thank you very much for attending, and let me thank you, our debaters. Thank you.